I was halfway through cataloging the results from the 10th year of my bloodline sequencing project when the lab door slammed open so violently it rattled the test tubes on the far wall. It didn't creak. It didn't nudge. It exploded inward, like a courtroom verdict crashing down in the form of splintered expectations and noise. I didn't even look up right away. I was too focused on parsing through the latest anomalies and the chromosomal deletions we'd tracked over generations. But then came the click of stiletto heels on tile, too deliberate to be casual, too angry to be performative. I looked up, and there she was. Althea, my ex-wife. My storm in a silk dress. She stood there framed by the doorway, wearing designer rage like it was tailored to her frame, sleek, sharp, and unforgiving. Her hair was pulled back with surgical precision, her makeup flawless as ever, but her eyes were a hurricane. She didn't say hello, didn't offer a pretense of civility. She just stormed forward like a force of nature, her clutch purse falling to the floor as she raised her manicured hands and began tearing through the nearest stack of files like a woman searching for proof in a fire. "You don't deserve this breakthrough, Silas," she shrieked, her voice bouncing off the sterile lab walls like the screech of a warning system. "Grayson does. He's got real vision. He's going to get this to the world." The file cabinets trembled as she yanked drawers open and dumped their contents onto the floor. Pages flew, decades of genetic mapping, my predictive models, annotated sequences on rare recessive mutations, my grandfather's old blood pathology notes, ink now smeared under her frantic palms. Still, I didn't move. I didn't stop her. I didn't raise my voice or plead or run for the backup safe like some desperate researcher on the verge of collapse. I stood still, watching her with the quiet of a man who had died a long time ago and simply hadn't told anyone. My project was 10 years old, but its roots stretched back to before I was born, to my grandfather, whose mysterious illness made his final years a waking nightmare, to my uncle, who lived in denial until the mutation claimed his mind, to my own blood, which I'd been studying for so long I sometimes forgot what normal felt like. Every document she shredded, every report she stomped on, every vial she sent clattering across the tile was a piece of a story that no one had ever bothered to read, except me. "Say something," she screamed, whipping around to face me, strands of her perfect hair now fraying from the heat of her own fury. "You think you can lock me out after everything I gave you? You think you can just erase me?" She knocked over the centrifuge with her elbow. Glass cracked. Liquid splashed across the counter. My heart thudded, but I still didn't move. "Grayson knows how to take this public. You'd keep it buried in journals and endless peer review. He wants impact, and he believes in me." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and what I saw wasn't a villain or a thief. It was someone drowning in her own ego, her own desperation to matter. Somewhere deep in her psyche, she'd convinced herself this research was hers too. Maybe because she once proofread my grant proposals. Maybe because she threw parties for investors back when we were still a team. But mostly because Grayson, her latest messiah in a tailored suit, told her it was. "You gave up your rights to this the day you walked away," I said quietly, not as a threat but as a fact. "And you never understood what it really was. This isn't about glory or money, Althea. This is about blood. About truth." Her lip curled. "No, Silas. This is about being first. Grayson gets that. He doesn't waste time obsessing over family ghosts. Maybe because he has a few of his own," I muttered under my breath, not loud enough for her to hear. "Not yet." She kept tearing through the room, and I let her. I let her throw her tantrum like a child too late for Christmas. And while the sound of destruction filled the lab, the crack of binders, the scrape of metal drawers, the low whine of damaged equipment, I simply picked up my notebook and made a single note in the margin. Expected interference. 2 years post-divorce. Right on schedule. She turned back toward me, breathing heavily, her dress clinging to her like silk desperation. "You're going to regret this." "I already did," I said. 2 years ago. And with that, she stopped. Not because I'd said something particularly cutting, but because she finally realized I wasn't fighting her. That I hadn't tried to save the papers she shredded or scream about the data she'd scattered. She looked down at the wreckage. Her shoes were planted in a sea of paper, stained by blue ink and broken plastic. That's when it hit her. "You didn't back any of this up, did you?" she asked, something like panic creeping into her voice for the first time. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She narrowed her eyes, searching my face for a crack, a twitch, a tell. But I'd spent 10 years researching how the smallest genetic mutations could change everything. I'd long ago mastered the art of stillness. She took a step forward. "Where is it, Silas?" I finally smiled. "Just a little." I guess Grayson's real vision didn't include asking the right questions. She looked ready to scream again, but at that exact moment, someone else entered. Another silhouette in the doorway. Not a storm. A shadow. But that was for another chapter. For now, I stood in the wreckage of my life's work, and I didn't panic. Because I knew something Althea didn't. Storms pass. But the truth? The truth has backups. The lab was still too still after Althea left. Papers lay shredded across the floor like the aftermath of a storm pretending to be human. I didn't clean them up. Not yet. I just stood there, letting the silence settle into my bones, into that familiar corner of my mind where she'd once lived, where I used to replay old fights and try to make sense of the woman I married. Althea and I had been divorced for 2 years. She walked out of our marriage like she was walking off a runway, unapologetically radiant, chin high, never looking back. She took the penthouse, the art collection we argued over during mediation, the social calendar full of hollow wine tastings and gallery openings that used to exhaust me. And she took something else too, my name, my peace, and most of my pride. All I kept was the lab. And the silence. That silence became sacred. It had a rhythm, a heartbeat. The gentle hum of refrigeration units, the flicker of old fluorescents from the overhead bulbs, the soft tap of keystrokes when I was too deep into genome chains to remember the time. It wasn't much, not by the world's standards, but it was the only thing that ever made sense to me. She never understood the project. Not really. She used to ask me, between glasses of red wine and designer catalog browsing, why I spent so much time mapping bloodlines. Why I stared at old hospital charts and handwritten ledgers from my grandfather's fieldwork in rural Maine. To her, it was all too quiet, too slow. "You're a brilliant man wasting himself in the past," she once told me, half naked, frustrated that I'd missed a fundraiser to run an unexpected test batch. But it wasn't just DNA to me. It was family. It was fear. It was a secret that lived inside the men in our bloodline, something invisible that stole lives early and left confusion in its wake. My grandfather died at 52, after years of inexplicable tremors and collapsed organs. My uncle lasted until 49. My cousin Devin started showing signs last year. I was 38 and waking up every morning with a ticking clock inside me. The project wasn't about publication. It wasn't about glory. It was about survival, redemption, closure. But now she claimed it. Not for herself, of course. No, Althea had found her new star. Grayson Laird, the venture capitalist with a squared jaw, a glass office in Midtown, and a smile sharp enough to cut patents in half. The man who saw dollar signs in every petri dish, who used words like disruption and exit strategy while sipping bourbon and convincing Althea that she, too, was a visionary. And I knew how he worked. Grayson didn't just invest in companies. He invested in people. People like Althea, who crave significance more than stability. They wanted the project. My project. Only she had no idea what was about to happen. I walked over to the far corner of the lab, where my grandfather's old microscope sat like a relic from another world. I traced the chipped brass base with my fingers. I cleaned it the day I got the divorce papers. Spent hours taking it apart, oiling each gear, pretending that precision could still fix something. I remember the envelope. Thick parchment, couriered like it carried an invitation to a masquerade. Inside, 3 signatures, a court seal, and a clause about irreconcilable differences. I'd laughed, quietly, bitterly. There was nothing irreconcilable about what we'd become. We were just done. She left, and I stayed behind with the ghosts in my blood. Now she wanted to resurrect those ghosts for profit. I pulled open the drawer beneath the microscope and retrieved a slim black folder, one of the few things I didn't keep in digital format. Inside were the original notes. Not mine. My grandfather's. Yellowed, scribbled in ink that had faded in places but still held his urgency. There were names, medical histories, symptoms no one could trace back then. But I traced them. Over 10 years, I'd followed the trail like a hound, linking each illness to a specific mutation in the Y chromosome passed down through our line. A mutation so rare it didn't appear in any public genome bank. But it was there, in me, waiting. I closed the folder and sat at my desk. When we were married, I told Althea everything. I thought that was what trust looked like. She knew the fear that kept me up at night, the family stories that never made it into official records, the way my hands sometimes shook after long shifts in the lab. She knew, and still she walked. And now she came back, not to make peace, not even to gloat, but to claim what she believed she'd earned by proximity. As if sitting next to me while I suffered meant she deserved a piece of the cure I'd scraped out of decades of doubt. But she didn't know. She didn't know that the data she trashed was already backed up twice, that the results had been submitted to 3 independent peer reviewers under embargo, that I had a redundancy protocol that didn't just cover sabotage, it anticipated it. She didn't know that this wasn't just research anymore. It was personal, the blood marker I'd isolated. The mutation that haunted us was one I could now inhibit. Not fully cure, not yet, but delay, contain, possibly pass down a dormant copy instead of an active one. It was enough to shift the trajectory of a generation. Enough to rewrite the story my grandfather died trying to understand. Grayson wanted to sell it. Package it as a miracle treatment for early-onset organ decay. Slap a corporate label on it, and run clinical trials that would prioritize optics over science. I knew that because one of his analysts emailed me 6 months ago. We believe there's potential here, she'd written, all smooth marketing polish. We'd like to discuss licensing. I'd never responded. I knew their game. Hype over help. And now Althea wanted to walk in and claim it in his name. I stood up, exhaled slowly, and finally began picking up the files from the floor. Some were beyond saving ink smudged, pages torn, but most were just scattered, like I'd been, once. Only I wasn't scattered anymore. I was aligned, focused, ready. The door buzzed again, softly this time. I looked up. A man in an expensive suit stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of smirk people wear when they've already decided you're going to lose. But this time, they were wrong. He walked in like he owned the building. Smooth leather shoes whispering across the tile, briefcase swinging from 2 fingers like a loaded weapon that didn't need to be drawn to be lethal. I'd seen that type before. Wall Street groomed. Ivy League finished. Sharp eyes behind sleeker lenses. The kind of man who could dismantle your life in a paragraph and still make it sound like a compliment. He didn't introduce himself. Just gave me a curt nod and said, Dr. Ward. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. My lab coat was still speckled with remnants of the chaos Althea had just left in her wake. Papers scattered. Notes askew. The centrifuge half dismantled. The smell of something acidic still lingering faintly from the spill she'd caused. But I didn't look rattled. I refused to give him that. He stepped aside, holding the door open. And there she was again, Althea. Composed now. Back in performance mode. Her lipstick reapplied. Her eyes icy. She'd always been able to reset herself like a computer, just shut down and restart, with no trace of the madness that came before. Ms. Laird, the lawyer began, making it clear where his allegiance stood, has retained me to oversee the transfer of research documentation, including but not limited to raw data, sequenced results, and all supporting files, physical or digital, pursuant to a forthcoming motion. I kept my gaze steady. A motion? Yes, he replied, pulling a folded document from his case. To claim shared intellectual property rights under marital contribution. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the desperation was so loud it practically echoed. She stood behind him, arms crossed, lips tight in a smirk I knew too well. It was the look she used when she thought she'd already won. You're trying to retroactively stake a claim on 10 years of my work, I said, my voice even, but low. Based on what? That she poured me a glass of wine while I was decoding genome markers. Althea stepped forward then, her tone syrupy and smug. Don't be petty, Silas. I supported you. I was there. You know I was. No, I said, looking directly at her. You were in the penthouse. And when things got real, when the test failed, when the grant was denied, when I thought the mutation skipped me because I was too scared to test my own blood, you were nowhere. Her smirk faltered. But the lawyer didn't flinch. He simply cleared his throat and said, the courts have recently upheld cases where emotional support during research development constituted contribution. If it goes to trial, it won't, I said. He paused. You sound confident, Althea muttered, her voice suddenly unsure. I was, because I'd been preparing for this moment for years. The moment someone would try to steal the truth and twist it into something marketable, something profitable. I wasn't stupid. I hadn't survived 10 years of academic infighting, grant rejection, imposter syndrome, and corporate leeches without learning how to protect what mattered. But before I could speak again, the lawyer's phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He glanced down, gave a slight nod of apology, and stepped away to answer it near the wall of cold storage units. Althea turned to me. You're really going to play the martyr here? Pretend like I didn't help you survive those first years. I tilted my head. You helped my image survive. That's not the same. The lawyer's voice, now low and urgent, slipped through the sterile hum of lab equipment. He wasn't using legal jargon anymore. Whatever he was hearing had nothing to do with me. I understand. When? Where? No, that's not what she told me. I watched the color drain from his face like an eclipse happening in real time. His back straightened. His shoulders tensed. He ended the call and turned back toward Althea with a face that had lost its performative professionalism. He wasn't the confident legal vulture anymore. Now he looked like a man asked to clean up a mess bigger than his retainer. Ms. Laird, he said carefully, voice quieter now. I need to speak with you. Alone. Her eyebrows knit. About what? It's urgent, he said. And private. She stared at him, confused for the first time since she'd stepped into my lab. Still, she followed him to the far corner, just beyond the biometric freezer, near the secondary emergency exit. Their voices dipped into hushed tones, but the word Grayson still cut the air like a blade. Then came another phrase. Quieter, but I heard it. What do you mean another family? The syllables hung there, suspended in the air between sterilized instruments and sterile intentions. And then softer, broken 5 kids? I turned back to my desk and pretended to sort through my notes, but I could see her face from the reflection in the chrome stand of my old microscope. Her lips parted. Her breath caught. Her balance shifted. The carefully curated mask cracked. The lawyer said something else, but it was lost in the silence that followed. I knew that silence. It was the kind that follows impact. The kind of stillness that descends right after a car crashes but before anyone screams. When she turned to look at me again, it was different. Gone was the predator. Gone was the heir apparent to someone else's empire. What stood there now was something smaller. Something brittle. How long have you known? She asked. I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to sit with it. I didn't, I finally said. But I always suspected. She swallowed. Why didn't you warn me? I looked her in the eyes. Because you weren't mine to protect anymore. Her expression shifted again. Something broke behind her pupils. A dam, maybe. Or a wall. The lawyer stood awkwardly beside her, hands now buried deep in his pockets. We'll reconsider the motion, he said, voice faltering. You'll withdraw it, I corrected him. You came in here to claim my life's work. Now you can go back and rewrite your definition of partnership. They both stood there for a second too long. Althea stared at the floor like she could will it to open up and swallow her. She looked at the chaos around her, the overturned samples, the stained floor, the ruined centrifuge, and for the first time, I saw shame crawl across her features. I didn't know, she whispered. No, I said. You didn't care. And that was the difference. They left without another word. As the door clicked shut behind them, I walked to the reinforced cabinet in the corner, past the mess she made, past the ghost still whispering through the blood samples. I keyed in the override code and reached behind the stacked coolant tanks. It was time to bring out the backup. The silence that returned after they left was different. Not the kind I usually worked in. Not the kind built from concentration and solitude. This was the aftermath of chaos. The kind of stillness that follows impact, but before healing. I didn't rush to fix the mess. I didn't sweep the shattered glass from the floor or realign the pages strewn across the lab like the bones of a dissected life. I let it sit. I let it remind me. I walked slowly across the room, stepping over the pile of torn files Althea had created in her rage. Most were decoys anyway, deliberately outdated documentation I kept on the surface in case anyone ever thought they could walk in and steal what they didn't build. She thought she'd ruin me. But I'd always known a storm like her might come again. Betrayal leaves echoes, and I had long since trained myself to listen for them. At the far end of the lab, near the industrial freezer unit where the most sensitive samples were stored, I reached behind the backup nitrogen tank and twisted open a small metal panel in the wall. Most people didn't even notice it camouflaged against the brushed steel interior. But I wasn't most people. And this wasn't just a lab. Inside was a narrow, locked cabinet, reinforced with heat-resistant titanium. Keypad protected. I entered the code slowly, almost ceremonially. 6 digits. The year my grandfather died, and the exact time his final test results arrived in the mail. Results no one opened until after his funeral. He never got to read the truth, but I had. The lock disengaged with a soft click. I opened the door and pulled out the fireproof safe. It was heavier than it looked, built with enough density to survive flames, floods, or fury in a silk dress. I placed it gently on the central table, cleared a space with one arm, and knelt beside it. Inside were 5 flash drives, each color-coded, each encrypted with a separate passphrase. I had them mirrored in cold storage in 3 undisclosed locations. One in a server I personally maintained in Maine, another in a climate-controlled basement Diane once offered me access to, and a third buried inside the research servers at Lingen and Roth, under an alias I registered 5 years ago. This was the real work. Every breakthrough, every sequence, every anomaly I traced through 4 generations of male descendants in my family. The entire map of the mutation, the hypothesis, the early models for inhibition, the trials, some failures, some terrifyingly promising. And then there were the logs. The ones I never shared with anyone, not even Diane. Recordings of symptoms I'd started noticing in myself. Numbness in the tips of my fingers. Vertigo that lasted longer than I could justify. A heart murmur that came and went like a stranger knocking in the dark. I hadn't run a full panel on myself. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But the possibility of carrying the same unstable gene was why I started the research in the first place. I had to understand it. I had to fight it. I set the drives on the table, lined them up. Red, blue, black, white, silver. Then I took out the printed logs, the analog backups. If power failed, if encryption broke, if memory ever became a liability, the truth would still be here, in ink and paper, inside acid-free sleeves. I heard movement behind me and stood quickly, rotating on instinct. Althea. I didn't hear the door open. She hadn't slammed it this time. She was just there, quiet, still, and watching me like someone catching sight of a ghost they didn't expect to see again. Her arms hung loosely at her sides. Her heels were off, held in one hand like they were weapons she didn't have the strength to wield anymore. You backed it up, she said, and there was no fire in her voice now. Just disbelief. Maybe awe, maybe shame. I always do, I said evenly, standing tall. I didn't spend a decade studying the fragility of bloodlines without preparing for betrayal. Her eyes flicked to the table, the drives, the printed logs, the safe, and then back to me. I thought, I didn't think you'd expect me to. Yes, you did, I interrupted. You didn't think I could stop you. That's different. Her breath caught, but she didn't deny it. She looked down, her voice soft. Grayson said it would be easy, that I had rights, that you were careless with your data. I laughed once, quietly, bitterly. He was right about one thing. You had rights. You gave them up. She blinked. I was angry. You made me feel invisible. No, I said. I made you feel unimportant to something that wasn't yours. There's a difference. She moved closer, and I tensed, just slightly. The air shifted. The light flickered above us like it knew a truth was about to fall into the open. What happens now? She asked. I stared at her. You go home. You tell your lawyer to bury that motion in the same file where Grayson keeps the names of his other wives. You disappear from this project, from this lab, from anything with my name on it. And if you ever even think about touching what I build again, you'll find out just how airtight intellectual property law can be when you're not the one funding it. She swallowed. Silas, I didn't know about the other family. The kids. I didn't, I know, I said. But that's not the point. She nodded slowly, looked around the lab, at what she'd damaged, what she couldn't steal, at the man standing in front of her, someone she'd once loved, then underestimated. Goodbye, Silas, she said finally, and it sounded different than it had in court. Goodbye, Althea. She left for the second time in our lives, and this time she didn't look back. I stood there for a long while, alone again, the hum of the freezer returning to full volume in my ears. I moved the drives back into the safe, locked it, and returned it to its hiding place. Then I walked to the center of the room and slowly began picking up what mattered from the floor, my notes, my charts, my maps of blood and truth. And I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. The thing about men like Grayson Laird is they never plan to get caught. They build their lives like investment portfolios. Diversified, layered, protected by jargon, and just enough charm to distract from the rot underneath. But charm doesn't make a good foundation. And when the weight of too many lies settles in one place, the whole structure begins to collapse. Fast. I didn't have to lift a finger. The collapse began 2 days after Althea's second visit to the lab. I was reviewing comparative gene expression models when an alert pinged on my secondary laptop. An automated flag tied to Grayson's name in the biotech forums I monitored for intellectual property infringement. I opened the thread, expecting the usual startup bluster or another shallow article about disrupting legacy genetics. What I found instead was a post titled, "Buyer Beware, the Many Wives and Wallets of Grayson Laird." It read like a criminal indictment wrapped in gossip. A woman from New Jersey detailed her 4-year marriage to Grayson, complete with photos. Another from Austin chimed in, describing the exact same promises, the same wedding ring, the same lies. 5 kids between them. 2 homes. One restraining order from a third woman in Santa Barbara who said he'd used her inheritance to fund an incubator that never actually existed. Each comment was a pinprick. The thread ballooned with momentum until it burst into public view. Screenshots, court documents, links to business filings under different names. By the end of the night, Grayson's name was tagged across multiple watchdog accounts. Even LinkedIn suspended his profile after someone uploaded a side-by-side of his overlapping wedding licenses. The best part? None of it came from me. Althea tried to spin it, at first. Her publicist released a soft denial on her behalf, something vague about being unaware of the full extent of Grayson's personal life. But the forums didn't care about her curated language. They cared about the receipts. About the women he conned, the investors he charmed, the lives he treated like leverage. The cracks in her world widened quickly. She stopped posting on social media, stopped showing up to events. People whispered that she'd been tricked, that she was collateral. But I knew better. Althea wasn't a victim. Not really. She saw what she wanted to see, a man with ambition who promised her significance. And when he pointed to my research and said, "We can build something bigger," she didn't ask for proof. She asked for access. But that access came with a price. The morning she showed up at my lab again, she didn't wear silk. She wore jeans and a gray cardigan I remembered from the first year of our marriage. Her makeup was minimal. Her eyes looked like they hadn't rested in days. She held a file in her hand. No lawyer, no entourage, no theatrics. I didn't ask her to sit. She didn't ask for permission. She walked to the center table and placed the folder down slowly. "You should read this," she said. Her voice was thin, strained. "It's everything I found. The marriage certificates, the photos, investment contracts with forged names. One of them is my name. I didn't move. You brought me proof of the man you helped almost ruin me." "No," she said quietly. "I brought you proof of how stupid I was." I finally looked at her. There was no venom in her expression now. No performance. Just grief. And maybe, just maybe, a trace of remorse. But it was too late for that. I opened the file. It was all there. Originals. Signed contracts. Bank transfers. Private emails. She wasn't lying. "You're trying to undo it now," I said. "But you still tried to take what wasn't yours." She nodded. "I know. I don't need your apologies." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, and her voice almost cracked. "I'm just trying to keep someone else from being next." I closed the file. "You said he was going to take this to the world," I said slowly. Repeating her words from that day, she tore through my work like a woman possessed. That he had real vision. She looked down. He had a script. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, one I'd printed 2 weeks earlier, after backing up the project for clinical review. It was a summary. Grayson's background, compiled from public and private records. I'd started compiling it the moment his name came up in biotech spaces. I never finished it, because I didn't need to. The truth was writing itself. I handed her the sheet. She scanned it slowly. Her fingers trembled slightly at the edges. I watched her face as she absorbed each line. The overlapping residences, the LLCs with no staff, the alias used for credit inquiries. Then, I waited. It took her a full 2 minutes before she looked up, eyes rimmed in red. "How long have you had this?" "Long enough to know you'd never believe it from me." She shook her head slowly, lips pressed tight. "He used me." "So did you," I replied. Calm, measured, truthful. She said nothing, just stood there, holding the paper, shoulders slumped like someone finally realizing the house she built had no foundation. All those parties, those interviews, those smug comments about vision. They were the walls of a house made from cards. And now they fluttered down around her ankles like leaves in a windstorm. I walked to the small fridge in the back, pulled out a bottle of water, and set it on the table near her. She didn't touch it. "You should go," I said softly, "before you become the next headline." She nodded slowly, and when she walked to the door, her steps were unsteady. No heels this time. No dramatic exit. Just silence. And when she was gone, I sat alone with the folder she brought and the summary I'd given her, and I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. I felt sorry for her. Not because she'd been fooled, but because she'd been so hungry to matter that she let a fraud build her meaning. She tried to steal my legacy to fill the hole he promised to patch. But I had something she didn't. The truth. And it was intact. That night, long after the lab lights dimmed and the weight of everything she left behind settled back into dust, I went home. Not to the townhouse I kept for appearances, the one near the university with sterile furniture and shelves of untouched cookbooks. I went home in the older, deeper sense, where memories stretched beneath floorboards and ghosts lived between letters no one opened. I went to my childhood house, the one I inherited after my mother passed. The one that still smelled like cedar, old vinyl, and unfinished goodbyes. I hadn't been back in months. Maybe longer. The driveway was cracked in familiar places, the porch light flickered like it always had, and the brass mailbox clung to the siding by one final stubborn screw. I let myself in quietly, as if time could be startled. No one waited for me inside, but I still paused in the entryway, listening for her voice, for the radio she used to leave playing softly in the kitchen, tuned to the same jazz station she swore kept the walls from sagging. I walked past the hallway mirror, catching a glimpse of myself in the dim light, older, sharper, maybe more tired than I wanted to admit. I didn't come here for comfort. I came for something I'd avoided for too long. My mother's violin case was where it had always been. In the coat closet behind the unused umbrellas and a stack of shoeboxes filled with photos no one could throw away. The case was heavy, not because of the instrument, it had been broken for years, but because of what she'd hidden inside it. I'd found the envelope after her funeral, tucked beneath the velvet lining. My name was on it, and my grandfather's script. No stamp. No address. Just a letter sealed in wax and silence. I carried it to the dining room table and sat where he used to sit, tapping his fingers in thought while sketching molecules on napkins. The envelope felt heavier now than it had when I first discovered it. Maybe because of everything that had happened. Maybe because I was finally ready to break it open. I cracked the seal gently, unfolding the pages with the reverence you give something that can't be unread. His handwriting was jagged and impatient, like every word cost him something, but it was unmistakably his. The man who taught me to ask why even when the answer was already bleeding. The man who died before I could understand why he trembled every time he touched a test tube. Silas, it began. If you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to explain what runs through us. Not just in name. In blood. I exhaled slowly. The words weren't just a letter. They were a map through something I'd always felt but never fully traced. What you're studying is not theoretical. It's not clean. It's not elegant. It's the curse that killed your uncle. It nearly broke me. It may already live in you. I saw it once under a microscope, a mutation too stubborn to die. I tracked it, feared it, sometimes pretended it wasn't there. But it is. And it changes everything. I kept reading, each sentence folding memory into revelation. This isn't about a disease. It's about a story. One that was never written down because no one wanted to believe that something so small could destroy entire lives. We come from a long line of people who believed in endurance more than answers. That ends with you. I blinked hard. My hands tightened around the paper. You're not just a scientist. You're the heir to a lie that killed good men quietly. What you uncover may break things, Silas, but it will also build something new, something honest. That's the only legacy worth having. The signature at the bottom wasn't clean. The ink had bled slightly, like the paper had wept with time. Grandfather. I set the letter down, my heart thudding with the kind of rhythm you don't measure in beats, but in truths finally spoken. He'd known. All those years I thought I was alone in the obsession, tracing the fragile loops of a hidden disease, diving into inherited decay like it was my personal madness. He'd already lived it. He just hadn't finished the work. Maybe he ran out of time. Or maybe he thought it would die with him. But it hadn't. It had passed through my uncle, my cousin, me. I stood slowly and walked to the kitchen. The light still worked, dim and amber like always. I made tea, not because I needed it, but because ritual grounds us. I remembered how he used to swirl honey into his with a spoon he swore was older than the house itself. He used to tell me that science was like tea. You never got it right if you rushed it. I sipped in silence, the letter beside me like a relic that demanded its own gravity. He didn't just give me facts. He gave me permission to see this not just as a diagnosis waiting to be solved, but as a legacy that needed reckoning. He'd been right. The truth ran through us. But so did the lie, the denial, the silence, the way our family talked about symptoms like they were accidents instead of inevitabilities. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing shadows. I was continuing a story that had almost been erased. And in doing so, I was building something that could outlive me. Not for profit, not for prestige, but for clarity, for closure, for the next child born with our blood and a chance to live without the same fear. I looked around the kitchen, the cracked tile, the worn counter, the light fixture that hummed faintly. It was all still here, waiting for me to catch up. I didn't go back to the lab that night. I stayed in that house with the ghosts and the letter and the smell of my mother's old perfume barely lingering on the air. I read the letter 3 more times before dawn, each word carving a deeper certainty into my chest. This wasn't just about Althea, or Grayson, or even the research. It was about finishing what my grandfather started, and making sure no one ever tried to bury it again. A week later, I stood at the edge of a glass-walled boardroom in Midtown, hands clasped behind my back, watching a skyline built on ambition and deception. The Hudson glimmered in the distance, but the real storm was forming behind me, one briefcase at a time, one steel expression after another. The biotech firm's board was assembling, 12 members deep, all here to determine the fate of a project they thought could be purchased, redirected, or retrofitted to fit their business model. They didn't know me. Not really. They knew what Althea had told them, what Grayson had promised. The surface-level details, the promising results, the unique inheritance markers, the patent potential. But what they didn't know, what they never expected, was that I'd already beat them to the finish line. They were here to negotiate theft. I was here to show them it was already too late. Dr. Ward, said a gray-haired man in a $3,000 suit. His nameplate read Preston Carlisle, chair. We're glad you could join us. I gave him a brief nod, then looked across the table at the one seat still conspicuously empty, Althea's. She was running late, or maybe just stalling. Either way, it didn't matter. The boardroom had that scent exclusive to money, polished wood, expensive coffee, and recycled air that was never quite fresh. The walls were lined with framed press releases and accolades, proclamations of innovation, of progress. But all I saw were reminders that these people didn't care what was discovered, only who profited from it. We've reviewed the preliminary data provided by Ms. Laird, another board member began, tapping a file folder beside his MacBook. Promising stuff. We're interested in licensing options, provided the ownership claims can be sorted. And how do you plan to sort ownership claims? I asked, my voice calm but sharpened to a fine point. MS. Laird was married to you during the early development years, Preston interjected smoothly. That opens the door to shared intellectual property under certain interpretations of, I didn't let him finish. Stop, I said, and I watched the shift happen, the kind that follows the first unexpected move in a chess game. The air recalibrated. The board members leaned back, just slightly. They weren't used to scientists interrupting them. I reached into my case and laid 3 folders on the table. Each one labeled and tabbed, one for the clinical board, one for the legal team, and one for the firm's compliance officer, who sat 2 seats to the left and looked like she hadn't blinked once since I walked in. This is the patent, I said. Filed 2 years ago, under my name and the name of one other person. Not Althea Laird, not Grayson Laird, Diane Navarro. That last name pulled a visible ripple through the room. I continued. Ms. Navarro was my lab partner through the most critical phases of development. She co-authored the inhibition algorithm. She helped build the dataset that made the research viable for clinical trials. Her name is the only one that belongs beside mine. I didn't need to look at the faces to know some of them were already recalculating their positions. Investors know when they've been misled. What about Ms. Laird's contributions? One of them finally asked. If not scientific, then Althea threw a party once, I said flatly. She ordered catering and invited a journalist from an online lifestyle magazine who misspelled my name. That's the extent of her contributions. A quiet chuckle slipped from somewhere near the end of the table. Someone stifled it quickly, but I heard it. Momentum was shifting. Just then, the boardroom door opened. Althea walked in, wearing navy today, minimal jewelry. Her hair pulled back in a style that tried too hard to whisper professionalism. She gave a thin smile to the room and took her seat without acknowledging me. I apologize for the delay, she said smoothly. There was a transportation issue. I turned back to the board. Ms. Laird recently attempted to file a motion claiming shared ownership, I said. That motion was withdrawn after new personal information came to light. Information that would have made any trial very public. Althea's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Furthermore, I added, the patent has already been moved through initial phases of approval and is now under consideration by 2 separate clinical review boards. Trials are scheduled to begin in 6 months. None of that includes Ms. Laird, or her husband, who, last I checked, is now under federal investigation for investor fraud, bigamy, and securities violations. The room tightened. The compliance officer cleared her throat. We're aware of the allegations. We'll be conducting our own review, of course. You're welcome to, I said. But it won't change the fact that the research is already locked in, secured, licensed under independent review, and protected under every clause of intellectual property law I could legally and ethically activate. Preston leaned forward. So you're saying there's no deal to be made? No, I replied. There's a deal. But not the one you came for. I opened the final folder and slid copies of the licensing terms across the table. You want access to the treatment, you follow the ethical path. You partner with me and with Navarro. We direct the trials. We control the data. No name changes. No media spin. This doesn't become another case study in stolen science. You help us get this to the right hands the right way, or you walk. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Diane Navarro stepped into the room. Right on cue. She walked with the calm certainty of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. She wore a charcoal suit, hair tucked into a simple braid, no makeup, just clarity. She sat beside me, folded her hands, and said, We've already had offers. We came to you because we hoped you'd still value integrity. If that's changed, we'll take our research elsewhere. Preston looked between us. Diane, me, then Althea. And then he said the only words I needed to hear. We'll move forward with you. Althea stood abruptly, her chair scraping backward. You're making a mistake, she said. You're siding with a man who can't see beyond his own obsession. I rose from my chair, slowly, deliberately. No, I said. They're siding with someone who finished what your husband never even started. She turned to leave, her heels clicking a little too fast across the marble. No one followed. As the door shut behind her, I sat back down, my heart still, my breath easy for the first time in years. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. Grayson Laird fell the way most frauds do, loudly, quickly, and everywhere at once. It didn't start with a courtroom or a headline. It started with a woman named Elise Watterson, who posted a grainy wedding photo on a biotech forum. Just a simple caption, this is the man pitching his exclusive genetic cure. Also the father of my 3 kids, and the man who vanished 3 years ago. Within hours, another name surfaced. Then another. Then someone uploaded PDFs of financial disclosures showing overlapping business registrations, credit card statements, legal summons from 4 states. The posts multiplied, feeding on each other like fire licks up dry timber. The biotech community wasn't built for scandal. It was built for innovation, careful ambition, and academic warfare disguised as collaboration. So when one of its brightest visionaries was outed as a manipulative con artist, the collapse wasn't just swift. It was spectacular. I watched it all unfold from my office. I didn't interfere. I didn't comment. I just watched the house of cards implode. The article titles told the story better than I ever could. The Synthetic Savior. How Grayson Laird stole science and built a lie. Vows and Ventures. The bigamous empire of a biotech fraud. Investor alert. The cautionary tale of the man who promised a genetic revolution. By the time CNN Business reached out to me for comment, Grayson had deleted every trace of his online presence. His website redirected to a maintenance page. His Twitter gone. His company's LinkedIn listed no current employees. A few desperate voices tried to defend him in Reddit threads, calling him ahead of his time and misunderstood, but the evidence was too strong, too damning, and worse, too personal. It wasn't just professional betrayal. It was families, children, lives left in fragments while he jumped state lines in $1,000 suits, whispering funding promises to the next wealthy widow or boardroom of suckers. The man who once tried to slap his name on my decade of work was now the subject of a federal inquiry. I got an email from his second wife, technically second known wife. She thanked me for not keeping silent. I never replied. I hadn't spoken publicly at all. The world had burned Grayson down without needing my spark. Althea tried to distance herself, but the fallout stained everything. She went quiet, deleted her Instagram. A carefully worded statement appeared through her publicist. Ms. Laird is devastated to learn of her husband's past and was not aware of the multiple families or pending investigations. She is cooperating with authorities and focusing on her own healing at this time. The wording was surgical, but the damage was done. Every gallery that once fawned over her presence removed her photos from their websites. The biotech social circles that once invited her to panels and tastings replaced her with postdocs and clinical specialists. She had bet on Grayson, and Grayson lost. Meanwhile, I flew to Berlin. It was the first time I'd traveled overseas in years. I didn't go for pleasure or escape. I went for the International Inheritance Symposium, an annual gathering of geneticists, epidemiologists, and clinical researchers working on hereditary disorders. They had asked me to present my latest findings. The research I had spent over a decade on. The project Althea tried to take. The one Grayson wanted to sell like a shiny pill. My session was slotted for day 2, 10 a.m. room 402. Diane Navarro joined me at the podium, and together, we unveiled the breakthrough. A rare but trackable mutation affecting mitochondrial performance in males within a very specific genealogical cluster, one that we could now inhibit before it reached its most dangerous expression. We didn't dramatize. We didn't oversell. We showed data, proof, generational mapping, double-blind trials. We showed that science, done right, didn't need marketing gloss. When we finished, the room was silent for a second. Then came the applause, measured, then rising, then sustained. I didn't smile. Not yet. Because in that moment, all I could think about was my grandfather. I remembered the way his hand trembled when he poured coffee, the way he coughed and blamed dust when he knew it was something deeper. I remembered the sadness in my mother's voice when she said he never got to finish his work, never got to name the ghost eating away at his body. That ghost had haunted me for years. Now, we had a name for it. And more importantly, we had a weapon against it. After the presentation, I walked through the stone hallways of the venue, past exhibits and booths, researchers handing out leaflets and translations of abstracts. It all felt surreal. Not because I was finally here, but because I almost wasn't. If Althea had succeeded, if Grayson had gotten just a little further, none of this would belong to the people it was meant for. The research would be trapped in a patent dispute, buried in lawsuits, packaged for investors instead of patients. But I'd stopped it. Not with rage, not with revenge, with precision, with the kind of quiet, unshakable clarity that only comes when you've watched something rot and decided it would not consume you. Back at the hotel, Diane handed me a folder with new partnership offers. European labs, nonprofits, an NIH affiliate. They want to collaborate, she said. On your terms. I looked at the folder, then at her. On ours, I corrected gently. She smiled. Right, ours. We stood on the balcony for a while, the cold Berlin air wrapping around us like memory. Below, the city moved, buses, bikes, street musicians playing a melody I didn't recognize but didn't want to forget. Somewhere across the world, Grayson was hiding, spinning another version of himself. But that story was over now. Diane touched my arm. You didn't clap, she said softly. During the presentation. Everyone else did. But you didn't. I wasn't ready, I said. She nodded. What would make you ready? I thought for a moment. Seeing the treatment used. Seeing it save someone. Then, after a long pause, I added, knowing that my grandfather's ghost can finally rest. And then, for the first time in what felt like years, I let the cold wind carry something away from me, grief, maybe, or guilt, or just the weight of being silent for too long. Grayson Laird had fallen, and I was still standing. I stood on the auditorium stage with my palms open, fingers loose, the weight of what had come before finally lifting. Before me sat 200 journalists, geneticists, and clinical reviewers from across the globe, their attention fixed on the image glowing behind me. A black-and-white photograph of a man leaning over a microscope in a wool vest and rolled sleeves. My grandfather, Dr. Everett Ward, 1973, Harvard's biology wing. Back then, no one took his theories seriously. He talked about invisible signatures in the blood, molecular fingerprints passed from father to son that could rupture organs, destabilize cognitive patterns, shut down muscle function over time. They thought it was speculation, hysteria. They were wrong. This is where the work began, I said, the microphone catching the calm in my voice. Not in a high-rise lab or billion-dollar accelerator. It started here, in the hands of a man who couldn't explain why his body was betraying him, but was determined to find the answer. I clicked the remote, and the slide changed. Now it was a photo of the building we'd just broken ground on. A sleek, modern structure curved like the helix we'd spent years decoding. A sunlit entrance, lined with glass and pale stone. The name engraved above it, the Ward Institute for Genetic Inheritance. There was a long silence before the crowd applauded. Not polite applause, but the kind that comes from shared relief. They knew the journey. They'd seen how science often lived in shadows, obscured by red tape, egos, or money. But not here. Not this time. The next slide was a chart. A lineage tracing 4 generations of men, starting with Everett Ward and ending with me. Dotted lines tracked the mutation as it evolved. Muted sections where relatives had died too young. Bold highlights where our intervention had, for the first time, suppressed the worst of it in cell cultures. Our team, I continued, glancing toward Diane, who stood at the edge of the stage, has developed a sequence-specific inhibitor that can be deployed prenatally. In targeted subjects, it delays expression of the mutation well into late adulthood. In some projections, it neutralizes it entirely. This isn't just a map. It's a turning point. There were murmurs now, excited whispers passing through the crowd like sparks. One reporter raised his hand. "Dr. Ward, do you see this treatment being available to the public in the next year?" I nodded. If final trials hold up, yes. It will be offered initially to high-risk patients within closed networks. We're working with international partners to ensure access isn't limited by geography or wealth. This is about prevention, not profit. The room quieted again. They believed me. Not because I had all the answers, but because I'd walked through hell to earn the right to deliver the truth. I stepped away from the podium, letting Diane take the mic to discuss the clinical side. She was better at that part, explaining the numbers without making them sound cold. She had a way of turning data into story, of reminding people that every chart point represented a living person, often afraid, often desperate for a future that didn't end in slow collapse. As she spoke, I looked out over the crowd. In the third row sat my father, his gray suit worn proudly, his eyes shining. Next to him was my sister, who gripped his arm and nodded along even though she didn't understand half the medical terms. My old lab techs were near the back, the same ones who'd stayed after hours to run test after test, even when funding dried up. Beside them sat Diane's husband and kids, supporters from day one, cheering in their quiet way. But it was the empty chair beside my father that caught my attention. Althea's seat, reserved for her because, despite everything, I had sent her a formal invite through the foundation. I didn't want her back. I didn't want her involved. But something in me needed her to see that the thing she tried to take had grown beyond her reach. I didn't expect her to come, and she didn't. I didn't know if that brought me relief or something like sadness. Maybe both. The event ended with a soft reception, fruit platters, champagne flutes, hands shaken, backs patted. I moved through it all in a kind of quiet haze, accepting compliments with a nod, answering questions with patience. I was grateful, but I was also tired. Not exhausted, just full. Like someone who had carried a burden so long that when it finally came off, he didn't know where to place his hands. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the catering crew had started stacking the empty glasses, I walked back into the hall alone. The slide was still up on the main screen. My grandfather's photo, the institute's name, my name. It didn't feel like a monument to me. It felt like a ledger finally balanced. Diane joined me, her heels echoing softly. "They all left impressed," she said. "They should be," I replied. "Not with me. With the work." She nodded. "You've done something rare, Silas. You made it personal without making it about you. I looked at her, really looked. Through every phase of this journey, every setback, every breach of trust, she'd stayed. Not for glory, for belief. In the science. In me. In what it could mean for families like mine. Like hers. You helped me finish what I started. I said. I never thank you for that properly. You don't have to. I want to. She smiled. Then keep doing what you're doing. Keep making sure no one forgets who really owns this legacy. She turned to go but stopped halfway down the steps. You know, you can smile now. I did. Just a little. Because she was right. The name Althea once tried to claim was now etched in stone, not on a marriage certificate, not in the corners of court documents, but on something living. Something built to outlast us both. I was no longer the man watching his work slip through silk-covered hands. I was the heir. Not to grief. Not to failure. But to truth. And the institute behind me would make sure no one ever buried it again. The letter arrived without ceremony. No courier, no embossed stationery, no signature from a high-priced attorney. Just a cream envelope slipped through the university mail system, addressed in a handwriting I recognized immediately, elegant, deliberate, always a touch dramatic. Althea. I stared at it for a while before opening it. Part of me expected another storm. A veiled threat, a plea cloaked in manipulation, a last attempt to reclaim relevance in a story that had moved on without her. But it wasn't that. Just 4 lines. Silas, I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you're free now. Thank you for doing what I couldn't, protecting what mattered. Althea, no return address. No number. She didn't ask to meet. She didn't beg. She just ended it with silence. And for once, I let that be enough. I didn't write back. Instead, I turned the envelope over once more, then tucked it into the back of my grandfather's old journal, the same one I kept in my desk drawer, beneath the latest batch of trial results. It didn't need to be displayed. It just needed to be remembered. As a mark of closure. As a page I'd finally turned. That day, I walked the long hallway to my lab alone, coffee in hand, passing glass doors etched with new lettering, Ward Institute, Hereditary Research and Clinical Trials. The name was clean, bold, unshakable. My name, but not mine alone anymore. Inside, the lab was humming with life. Young techs leaned over microscopes, monitors blinked with data streams, and Diane was already at the far bench, examining protein inhibition markers like it was just another Tuesday. I stood at the threshold for a moment, letting the sound of progress wrap around me like a song I used to know. It didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like purpose. We'd secured 3 grant partnerships since the Berlin presentation. The NIH had greenlit a funding channel to expand our trials into rural communities. The treatment that once lived in a locked cabinet behind my freezer now had a production code, a clinical rollout strategy, and a real chance at becoming the very thing we once whispered about in cautious hope, a cure. And me? I'd never been more still. Not stagnant. Rooted. I no longer needed revenge. I no longer watched the forums waiting for Grayson's name to resurface. I no longer checked Althea's social feed at midnight out of some distant ache I hadn't yet named. I had Diane. I had my father calling every Friday to ask how his institute was doing. I had new students who asked questions with the same fire I once carried alone. I had mornings like this, quiet, steady, full. I walked to my office and paused in front of the small bronze plaque mounted beside the door. I hadn't ordered it. Diane had. It read, dedicated to those who protected the truth when it mattered most. 7 words. That was it. I touched it once, briefly, then stepped inside. The office was tidy, sun pouring through the floor-length windows, desk already stacked with papers that would keep me busy long into the evening. I didn't mind. This was the kind of work that built futures. There was a photo on the shelf, my grandfather in his lab coat, my mother beside him as a child, beaming. Below that, a printout of our inhibition model. And beside it, a sealed box with samples ready for the next testing phase. I sat down, opened my laptop, and typed a single line into my notes before the day began. Blood defines where we come from. But only truth defines where we go. Grandfather was right. And we were going exactly where he always hoped we would.